terms, but Data Factory Gen 2, Lakehouse, OneLake, Power BI, data warehouse components. What we're not covering today, because it's just a whole topic of its own, is data science pieces of Fabric, or real-time analytics pieces of Fabric, Internet of Things, or really getting on the licensing. It's just too new and it's going to be too weird. But that's going to be a framework that we're going to go through questions, get your juice flowing on what you might think is interesting. So I'll go to actually Corey first. Give us a little bio.
Thanks, Paul. My name is Corey Kunde. I'm principal architect at Core BTS. Been with the team there for 18 years and started out prior to that as a software developer and went into Time Skyline as a developer. And then about 14 years ago, had a really strong interest in SQL Server, and that finally carried me from software development into data analytics, and pretty much followed the Microsoft path the whole way. Moved into Azure years ago, and now we really focus on building out most of our data analytics projects and solutions on the Azure platform. And now with Fabric being Microsoft's next big push on a newer version of some of these services, we really just need to keep a close eye on it and understand what's there, what's not, and how it's going to progress. So I'm really looking forward to the topic and really love to keep this interactive. And there's tons to go over. We won't hit it all, so I'd rather focus on what's the priority of the interest of people here. So
Thanks, Corey.
Yeah.
Lucas.
Yeah, hi everyone. Lucas Bio. Been with Core for a little over a year, and have prior 10 years experience with data warehousing, business intelligence, data analytics, definitely on-prem stack as well as Azure. Definitely looking forward to talking about this and getting more in depth in Fabric.
Thanks, Lucas.
Yeah,
So,
thanks for having me.
Nicole, are you interested in still being asked questions as if a panelist, or you just want to moderate?
Moderate, please.
Good. I will put on an occasional, editorial comment as a semi-panelist as I moderate. Use my power. Sorry about that. All right, so kick us off, warm us up. Let's do two minutes or less. What is Microsoft Fabric?
2 minutes or less. All right. So as you can see, that this is Microsoft's kind of primary slide here that kind of sums it all up. But really, it's a re-implementation and a rebranding of Microsoft's core data analytics services, but brought together under one platform, more of a software as a service platform. Prior to Fabric, there was all these services existed in some form. However, now they're much more tightly integrated. If you're familiar with Power BI, which I heard a lot of Power BI, they're in that type of UI versus going to the Azure portal. Not really going to the Azure portal at all for this. And they've also enhanced and brought a lot more capabilities to a lot of the individual pieces that we can dig into further here.
Nice. Lucas, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely geared more towards a SaaS, software solution platform, bringing together some of the main technologies that are already available in Azure, but bringing them in a nice, compact, and easy to use interface similar to what we see with Power BI. A much more integration between the systems, having a single location, a OneLake, to store all of the data instead of each service having its own data lake. It's definitely the kind of unification of all the different analytical tools we have available. It's kind of like the Swiss Army knife of data analytics. So,
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, so given that it's an amalgamation of stuff, and what is its purpose? If all these tools existed before, what is the purpose of Microsoft Fabric, in your opinion, Corey?
I think really what Microsoft's big push here is a few different things. One is to bring these services together and standardized in a few different ways. Lucas mentioned One Lake. One Lake is, technically speaking, it's pretty much the same as Azure Data Lake Gen 2, which has been around for many years. But the way they implemented it as one data lake for your entire organization, which all these different services integrate with. On top of that, they also standardize on the Delta format. So Delta format is another file format, uses Parquet under the covers. It's been around for a while. It's been made open source a couple years ago, and Microsoft standardized on that. So data written by one service can be read by another, and that really helps you pick and choose on why you might use one service versus another, depending on if you are more of an enterprise developer or business analyst. The different tools are there for different people. So I think there's a strong push here to simplify the things. If you're familiar with building solutions in the Azure portal, you had to know a lot about each service and how to configure it and how to network it, and you really had to know. Here they take a lot of that away from you and just kind of have it work. Or that's the concept at least. So we'll see how it goes. And I think the other thing is just is behind the, another potential problem, I guess, depending on how you'll get it, is with Azure and all the services, there's lots of different cost structures for SQL Server, Data Lake, or Synapse, or ADF, you name it. Here, there's a very different model where you're billed by capacity and storage, but primarily capacity. So all the services use the same capacity, and that's what you're billed for. And we can dive deeper into that. But so those are, in my belief, why Microsoft's going down this path.
Lucas, what do you think that purpose is? Anything different than what Corey had in mind?
No, pretty similar. But I'll add to it. Microsoft started with Power BI years ago, and Fabric can kind of be thought of as an extension of Power BI. So it's really combining all these other services that currently we're building this data and sending it to Power BI. So this is really kind of bringing all of those together to support Power BI. I think it's a much more easier to manage and maintain as a product for Microsoft, and by doing so, they're able to pass along the cost savings of just having to manage these single product, as opposed to having multiple teams all working independently, are now being brought together. So it's definitely, as Power BI has really been accepted and utilized in the community, in business, I feel like Fabric will definitely follow suit.
Nice. Amy?
So does that mean extracts into Power BI go away because it can now just do live connections to the One Lake?
So the question is, do extracts into Power BI go away because now it's about dealing with extracts into One Lake? Lucas?
No, not necessarily. There are still Power BI data sets that are available that you can load into, but there is a new feature called Direct Lake that does allow for directly accessing the Delta files without the need of loading that in refreshes or incrementally. It's definitely a new product, a new service that's still being developed. So it's very fascinating, and yeah, would really like to see more.
Yeah, I think a lot of the things you're doing today can still be done, whether whether you move away from other services and use the ones that are in Fabric would be kind of the decision point as you utilize enough gains on the reasons to move to Fabric, whether it be cost or utilizing some of the new features. So I would say no, extracts, Power BI can be used in very much the same way.
On that front, notes I had made when you guys were talking about the purpose was this universe is about simplifying the stack, because there's a huge stack of these tools that had existed in the Microsoft's analytics stack, simplifying it by bringing it closer together in one. And from another perspective, as a Power BI guy, I could say it complicates the hell out of Power BI because it adds a lot more functionality, and they just kind of mushed Power BI into Fabric.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways you can try to keep that a little bit separate is once you're in Fabric, it looks just like Power BI. You have the same interface, but you might have seen in your organization already down in the bottom left corner, you have the workload or persona switcher. And that's really meant to try to get you in the right tool set for what you're working with. So if you stick with Power BI down there, hopefully you can kind of keep that other stuff away if you're not really trying to use it, or if you're not needing to use it.
Nice. Any other comments on my challenge there, Lucas? Simplify but complicate?
Yeah, I definitely see it as kind of bringing the Azure users of Synapse or Data Factory and bringing them to Power BI to where everybody gets to work in the same user interface with the same data, the same security, and the same services, and not have to necessarily rely on switching between different user interfaces or modes of working.
Yeah, thanks. All right, let's dive a little bit into the components. Just a few words on kind of each of these. Lucas, what do you want to say about Data Factory Gen 2?
Yeah, so it is a simplified version of Data Factory as it is now, more geared towards working with OneLake and saving things in the data lake format. It has the same copy activities that we're used to seeing, same number of integrations and services that we can connect to and bring data in. And it's definitely performant. We don't necessarily need to worry about any of the scaling or like DTUs or anything associated with it. It'll just be able to consume based on the resources of our capacity.
Nice. What do you think about it, Data Factory Gen 2?
Yeah, it's another version of Data Factory. So it's version 3, I guess, is what they have out there. So there's that Azure Data Factory as the beginning one. That's just in Azure. Then Synapse had a version of Azure Data Factory that was built into it, which was similar to the original ADF. And and now we have this version here in Fabric. And I know it's not all there yet, as like all the components and task types aren't there, and those are supposed to be being built out. But I guess one of the bigger things that is different is the integration with what's called Data Flows Gen 2. So similar to like Power BI Data Flows, which is kind of the online Power Query interface with all the powerful, M type of, M language behind the scenes, but all the powerful transformations. That's now incorporated into Data Flows Gen 2, which is part of Fabric, which gives you a few things. One, it kind of replaces or I think it does replace the transformations that ADF originally had that were Spark based behind the scenes. And I'm not sure how much traction those ever really got. We tended not to use those a whole lot. We used Data Factory more for data movement and did the transformation more less in Databricks or Synapse Notebooks. And now with Gen 2, it's the Power Query interface, but instead of Spark being behind it, it's actually the Azure Data, the Fabric Data Warehouse, the new data warehouse component that we'll talk a little bit further. So it sounds like there's more power there, or a lot of power there with that service being incorporated behind the scenes. And now Azure Data Factory can kick off these Gen 2 data flows. And then the Gen 2 data flows on their own can even do what Gen 1, one of the major things Gen 1 couldn't, is write to different types of destinations. So that was always a limitation, or just maybe in, specifically imposed limitation on Microsoft, that Microsoft put on there, that you can only write to the data lake, but now you can write to the data lake, or OneLake. You can write to SQL Server. You can write to many. Well, I think there's 4 connectors right now, but it sounds like they're going to be really expanding those out.
All right, next, Lake House. Corey,
I have a question for Corey.
go.
You said writing out of Data Factory. One of the things that we cannot do is we ingest with Data Factory, but we can't write out to like other database sources outside of the Microsoft suite. Have you heard anything on that?
As far as I know, right now, I think the destinations are Data Lake, SQL Server. I think that includes on-prem and Azure-based SQL servers, and Synapse dedicated pools, which are not part of Fabric. And there might be a 4th one, but I did hear that they're going to try to build out. I mean, they have like 100 connectors for connecting 2 sources. I heard they're going to strive to kind of get to that level with destinations as well.
Thank you.
Well, the Lake House parts of Microsoft Fabric, what do you want to say about it?
Sure. So Lakehouse is a concept now that wasn't really there as a type of entity. In Fabric, you can go, just like you create a Azure Data Factory pipeline or Fabric Data Factory pipeline, now you can create a Lakehouse. And what Lakehouse consists of are files, which makes sense, right? Because a lot of times, or I should say, one common architecture pattern that's followed in a lot of modern implementations is medallion architecture, which is bronze, silver, and gold. You probably at least might have heard of that concept before. So the Lakehouse is trying to mimic that type of architecture. And so it has files where essentially points to the OneLake, as stored underneath. So you can ingest either your relational data, your file-based data, anything into like your bronze as more raw data. And then you can use the components of the Lakehouse which kind of replace the Synapse Spark side, which is really the Spark engine behind the Lakehouse. So you can write your notebooks in Python or SQL, or I think Scala is still there. And so really that really mimics that Synapse Spark engine, and also the Databricks component. So it's Microsoft's flavor of that. So and then everything again is stored as Delta under the as a result from a file-based system, so that like Lucas mentioned, Power BI can now read that, the data warehouse can read that. It's really nice to have that common file format.
Nice. So Lucas, we've got OneLake and Lakehouse kind of noted as separate topics, but I want to say, what would you say about them? Why are they different? OneLake and Lakehouse.
Yes. So OneLake is where the files would reside, and then Lakehouse is what would be sitting on it. The concept of Lakehouse is for dealing with ingesting of data, manipulating data, similar to how we would in data warehousing, but this is more geared towards working with files and not necessarily tables. So it's mainly run through the Spark engine, and will you interact with it using Spark. And like Corey had mentioned, the medallion architecture has been the kind of gold standard, if you will, for how to best organize your OneLake. Yeah, it is one thing about Fabric is there's many ways to do kind of the same thing, and so you may not necessarily need to have a Lakehouse, but it's there for if your development team utilizes Spark, or if they are wanting to bring in large amounts of data, they can use that as opposed to data warehouse, or have a combination of them to build out, additional models. But yeah.
Nice. So Lucas, there is the concept that we had here for Power BI Direct Lake. So what is that?
Yeah, so that will be where you're able to connect Power BI directly to your file system that's in OneLake. This is basically running the um, um, analysis services engine that powers Power BI, and it is able to read the Delta Parquet format. And so we're able to bypass the Power BI data set and access the data directly. So that means, we're really no longer limited to the size of data that we can query. So it definitely opens the door for a lot of different scenarios that, we're still, researching and learning. So
When you said Delta Parquet and Medallion, are those similar? Could you separate out the idea a little bit?
yeah, so Delta is Parquet is a file format that is columnar based as opposed to row based. And then Delta is a engine or a way of interacting with those Parquet files in you can kind of think of it as with a transactional log sitting next to it. And so these readers that are able to interact and query are going through this Delta specific parser or reader, and is able to um, efficiently and quickly bring that data to you.
Nice. And Medallion's relationship?
Oh yes, and so Medallion is more of a architecture on how you would organize your data, where bronze would be the data as it's received. Your silver, which would be like a mid-tier on joining things, cleaning things up, and then the gold layer would be what you would finally deliver for Power BI or downstream consumers.
Yep, gotcha. Tina, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a couple of them. So what is the typical time to get data like from an ERP platform into OneLake?
What is the experiences we've had getting data from an ERP into OneLake? Corey?
Yeah, I think, you could probably broaden that question and say really any source system, as long as there's a connector to it, or it can be queried via like an ODBC drive or something. But usually Azure Data Factory is the components, or in this case, Fabric Data Factory would be used to connect to that. And then if we're building a solution based on the Medallion architecture, it would really then flow into Bronze, the Bronze layer, as potentially Parquet files, potentially Delta format already. There's a lot of decisions you got to make on the architecture. So the Medallion architecture is a lot of pretty defined concepts at a high level. And when it gets down to implementation, there's many ways to do it. So I think in this case, it would be ingesting that data from the ERP system into Bronze. And then even then you have to decide on how you're going to have your folder structures. Because the idea is that that data in Bronze, one of the benefits is that it's data with storage being cheap, that data can be kept historically. So you could always go back to it, and then, do you do incremental loads day by day, however often you process things like that. So that's how.
What I also heard in your question was like a concern on time and things like that. And I would make a comment that as I got into cloud-based Microsoft tools from moving data around on premise, it was a change. I'm expecting Fabric to be using a similar process as it did with Azure Data Factory. And when we moved over to the cloud and said, let's just keep moving the data from our ERP into the bronze level, stored in a lake, and it took twice as long for it to load through into the cloud because it's going off premise, it's going up to those servers. So in our case, we were ready for that because we kind of expected it's just not going to be the same as on our internal network back and forth to another server.
So do you still do like change detection from on the extract of the ERP to only bring across changed records?
The question is, what does change detection take into factors here? Like, can you still do that with Fabric?
Ideally, you really want to, right? If you can, a lot of times that really depends on the capabilities of the source system, whether you have CDC or change tracking or even reliable timestamps, whatever mechanism. That doesn't really change, I don't think, with, this platform. Those challenges are still going to be the same.
Lucas?
Yeah, definitely. It is possible to integrate change data capture, but that's also one of the nice things with the medallion architecture is once you have you brought in that data into your bronze area, then you can do that comparison to see whether or not there has been changes, on a full data set if it's not possible to obtain that from the source system. And then in your silver layer, you can have all of that, all those changes, applied to the data that's there in your silver model. But you'll always have, that copy of how it was originally. So, yeah, there's definitely different ways to handle that. But there would also, like Paul was saying, you do need a connection to your on-prem, which would be through like a data gateway that is similar to Power BI today.
Nice. Go ahead, Cash.
So, Corey and Lucas, question I have is in the One Lake. So if we say had a structured SQL Server data source out there, right? When we are pulling this data into the bronze layer, are we keeping that as the same structure or are we converting them into Parquet files in One Lake?
So the question is, when we're bringing things into the bronze layer, are we trying to keep the structure or are we going with the Parquet format and we're transforming as we go into bronze?
Yeah, great question. So my view on it, and again, there's opinions on this. There really is. My view on it is that within bronze, you try to stay very specific to how the source is. If the source is a relational database, I think you have options. I think you could go store it in CSV if you wanted, but maybe more preferably Parquet, or maybe even Delta format, since it's even more easy to read with Delta. And just I want to just make one comment on Delta format. If you're not familiar with it, it really is just a file system, but it allows the data lake, whether it's Azure Data Lake or Fabric One Lake, to be queryable with SQL. So that's kind of the key that allows us to still use all the same SQL we've learned for many years in these newer technologies. So if your files are JSON or CSV, or maybe you're reading an API and gathering data, I would land that data in bronze in the structure that it comes. So that way, or in as close to the structure that it comes as possible. So that way, if you ever do need to reprocess it from the beginning, or you have different rules that, your business rules changed or down the road, you have close to what the true source was as possible. And then silver is where you start to curate and clean and do some of the things that where you start to do transformations.
So is that still good? So if I understand this correctly, I don't think I'm understanding it, but is that going to be in tables format? Say if my sources are in tables, structure, is that going to be in the bronze layer too?
So I think it's debatable. I think if your source data is like a SQL Server or a relational database, I think Delta format, like say you had an ADF pipeline that read from SQL Server and wrote to a Delta format in bronze, I think to me that's a very good way to do it, because then you can just use SQL to read right from that table, because any Delta table, you can use SQL from Spark or ADF.
So in that, what I'm hearing is it is being transformed into another file type. You're losing relationships, you're losing the things you might have had in a relational database, but you're trying to keep it almost the same with tables and things. Lucas, I want to hear contrary opinions to Corey, if any, on how raw is your bronze before I take another question.
Right. Yeah, I'll kind of piggyback off of what you were saying. So with the lake house, you can apply tables to the Delta formatted files once you bring them into OneLake and be able to query them with a SQL endpoint. However, for those relationships, constraints, those types of things are available to you in data warehousing, very similar to what we see in like Synapse serverless SQL today. So the underlying data is definitely going to change once it's brought into OneLake, and it's mainly for there's multiple ways, like in the image here on screen, there's multiple different engines and applications that can access this data. And by converting everything into one single format, all of these services can communicate with that data, at its bronze, silver, and gold levels, without having to, worry about converting from, a SQL Server to Oracle to, a custom ERP solution. So, yeah, by having a OneLake, you're also having a one format of a Delta Parquet file system.
Like it. Question over here?
Sure, got a couple of them. So if this is an embracement of a lake house architecture, and the whole point of having OneLake is to put data in the Delta Lake format so all these services can read it and write to it, or presumably read it, why have Synapse in here?
Everybody hear that question or should I repeat it? Going once, going twice.
Especially since I believe data engineering already has a SQL endpoint that can read out of the,
Corey's chomping at the bit.
Yeah,
Go.
sure. So it's a great question. I don't know, they're bringing Synapse in here as, the data engineering and the concepts of what Synapse had prior to Fabric here. But really, it's not the old Synapse. So you have a choice between a lake house, which when you get in a lake house, which is that Delta structure that you can query. It also comes along with the SQL endpoint, which is a connection string which you can connect to from Management Studio or any place like that, any type of consumer. But that lake house is really the data, is really the Spark-based components of Synapse. So that's what the lake house is. Then there's the data warehouse, which is more synonymous with what the dedicated SQL pools were in Synapse. However, it's a completely different engine. With the dedicated SQL pools, you had to, you would, determine how much compute you wanted behind it. And it was like a SQL Server where you didn't have much control over the storage. It was like SQL Server in the fact that it was proprietary storage, and SQL Server, for example, uses MDFs and LDFs under the covers. Here, now whether you choose the the lake house or the warehouse, two different engines in Fabric, you can choose, or you can use a combination. A lot of these services and a lot of the or one of the concepts around Fabric is that as Lucas I think said before, there's multiple ways to do things, and really may depend on, you may choose what you use based on your skill set. So if I am not a programmer and I don't want to touch Spark or Python, maybe I don't use the lake house as much and I use Gen 2 data flows. Or maybe if I don't want to use notebooks and Spark, but I'm like SQL Server, I'd use the warehouse. So there's different options. And there's multiple variables that go into why you'd want to use each option.
But just to be clear, there is no proprietary storage in Fabric?
That's right. So
Okay, that's interesting.
I think Databricks is a good example, right? It's in Azure, but it's its own service. So Databricks can read these Delta files. Anybody that can read Delta, any service, any company, as long as it can read the Delta standardized format, can read these files. So you still have to have compute somewhere. But in fact, and we didn't get into it, so capacity should be, and compute should be one more topic we hit on possible. So in here, the capacity or the compute's the same for all these services. It just depends on which engine you want to use.
Tina, did you have?
I think one of them was answered, but I guess the only other one would be, and this is just my lack of experience in all of this, for like trying to do budgeting and costing and all that stuff. Does Microsoft have any kind of a tool at all to plug stuff in and say, this is what it's gonna cost you on a monthly basis?
How do we better understand costs? Ooh, that's a good one. Go for it.
Right. I think that answer there's a couple components to that answer. So in the world today, if you go onto the portal and you try to look at your costs, it can be almost impossible to read, right? And you're not sure how to fix it because it was a month ago, and how do you know what you did exactly a month ago? And so it's just been complicated, always. And with Fabric, I think one of the big questions I have about Fabric from a cost perspective is, will the same workloads under Fabric and the new capacity model be cheaper or more expensive than being billed for all these different services individually? And so the way it works here now within Fabric is you have a capacity, and it's very similar to Power BI or Power BI Premium, where you pick the SKU. If you have a P1, you have like eight cores, or I think. So in a Fabric trial, you start out with those same 8 cores. And in Fabric, I think right now the pricing is like $7,000 a month if you leave that on the whole time. Now you can scale that up and down, but you can go all the way down to like an F1 SKU, which gives you the same compute that you can use on all these services, but you get like, I think a half a core, a quarter core, and that's $250 a month. And so I have not had the opportunity to put these SKUs through their paces as far as how much performance do you get for the cost. But from what I hear, that like just by listening to videos and industry, that you can get a decent amount of compute and resources out of some of the lower SKUs. And so that's my big question on, where is this gonna fall from a price standpoint for what you get?
Lucas, where's it falling for you, for people that ask you about how much is this gonna cost them when you say go to use a capacity model?
Right. Yeah, I like to say it's in preview. They're currently we're still in that trial, and they've actually extended it for a couple months. But once we get closer to general availability and the final first release of the product, there have been a few project managers that have spoken in videos and some blog posts and have said that there are going to be new SKUs brought out and made available. But what we've heard is those are going to be reserved instances. And so it's still kind of up in the air if it's going to be per product. Is it going to be specific for a workload, or is it going to be specific for the experience of data warehousing, or for data science, or is it going to be different for Fabric as a whole? So it's still kind of undecided what it's going to be once it's finally released. But there are apps within Fabric, similar to the metrics. It's escaping me. There's like a monitoring hub, and it does show you a breakdown of all the details at a time scale, similar to how the capacity is for Power BI.
Thank you. All right, we're in the final 5 minutes. So I'm dropping a question I thought was interesting, and Rachel helped me reinforce. Fabric is in preview. We just established that. Is it really ready for us to even try anything? There are a lot of known issues on a known issues list that they publish. To be transparent, it's pretty foundational stuff for this platform. Fabric is in preview. What do you want others to know as they're excited to get started using it? Is it ready, Corey?
Not for production, I would say. I think there's a lot there. I've played with it a decent amount. There's bugs and glitches, and the spinners spin for a while sometimes. But most everything I tried, I was able to do. So I think, it's decent, but, and I think it's worth playing with now, so that way you can start to understand what the features are. So that way you can start to form your opinion and see what it's gonna look like and how it might fit someone in here said, is there gonna be business value to go to it? Start to formulate that opinion. So, I'd say it's getting there. They have no indication on when the PA will be. My guess is next year, maybe. Because there's a lot of things that they just haven't developed yet. Like the T-SQL for the warehouse has a big long list that they say they're gonna implement, but it's just not there. The ADF S types, they're not all there. So that's just gonna take time. And, if you utilize any of that stuff now and you want to go there, it may just not be there. So I say it's still in investigation mode.
Lucas?
Yes, so for the Fabric, they do need to iron out a few things to get this production ready. But I feel like it's the same with Power BI. There's a large community around Power BI where you can offer suggestions and ideas and, say that there's a bug here. And they're responsive to that. I feel that same community is going to move towards Fabric. And so the more people that are using it, the more people providing feedback is just going to make it better. But it definitely is not something that I would run for production just yet. Maybe, early next year, you could possibly do some things, but we still don't have a release date on that. So, but it is good to get in there, use the trial. It's free, and explore and get familiar with it.
I think that it is important to start looking at it, because with the strong push on it, if Microsoft keeps their foot on the gas like it seems they are, that this is their next bet and they're gonna push for it, is that you do investigate it. Because if you are using things like Synapse dedicated pools or other types of technology, Azure Data Factory as it was in Azure, those things, this is what Microsoft does, they stop investing in them. And they work and are supported for a long time. So it's not like you need to get off of them, but they're gonna invest in here. And they've already said, at least in the warehouse, the data warehouse reminded me of Azure Analysis Services, how Azure Analysis Services is there and it's probably gonna be there for a long time, but they don't invest in it anymore. They still, I think, can keep the DAX versions up and things like that, but everything's been Power BI Premium. Same with the data warehouse. They said they're not gonna really invest in that. All their investment is going into the new data warehouse from Fabric. So that's just another thing to keep in mind on why you might want to at least understand what's changing. So that way down the road, you have a plan if you choose to migrate.
Thanks. That's a good question.
Yeah.
So if we switch on a trial and we're already a Power BI Premium customer, doesn't this use the instance, the capacity we already have?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if you're Power BI Premium, if you already have capacity Power BI Premium, that you can start to use these services.
So trying out Fabric, we can impact the capacity available for Power BI.
Yep, and when you turn on Fabric at the tenant level in the Power BI admin settings, you can turn it on for everybody, or you can turn it on for a security, group. So only,
Okay, but it is a shared capacity. We can't isolate it.
not unless you purchase separate capacity. So you can go to that Azure portal and purchase like an F1 for $250 and you assign that capacity to a
Okay,
workspace.
all right, cool. All right,
So it's separate.
thank you.
Okay,
Yeah, and I mean,
30 seconds.
okay, sure. Trying to make that. I'm just being a little curious. Is there a reason why they don't have Azure Data Studio or Azure Data Explorer as part of Fabric? Or is that on a roadmap feature? Because, I
don't
mean,
know.
I've worked with Azure Data Explorer and I mean, things we're talking about, like, reading directly from Parquet files. I mean, it does really awesome job there.
I don't have a good answer. Lucas, do you have any insight on that?
Yeah, so they are currently building extensions to connect with OneLake and these different services. There is a OneLake file explorer that integrates with Windows File Explorer, so you can, drag and drop directly into your OneLake, from your desktop. So, there will be more integrations and additional like APIs to work with, different settings that are also will be available. But similar to how you're able to run like Databricks notebooks in VS Code or Data Studio, will have the same compatibility with Fabric as things roll out. Just those teams are currently in development of getting that released.
Thank you, Lucas. All right. We're wrapping this up for the current discussion, but we only could cover the surface. There's a lot more to do on this. Feel free to make note of some others you may connect with here and keep bouncing questions off each other. The point of the meetup is to help people get connected as well as share some great topics. Let's give a round of applause for Corey and Lucas. And look ahead on the meetup site. Next time in October, we're welcoming back Sean Helwig to go over some best practices around data visualization. And even though we're wrapping up in the room here, please join me over at Holidays to socialize and reconnect, because as we've gotten back out of COVID, it's been great to see many of you again. So hopefully you'll join me over there at Holidays. But that's the official end of this. But don't run out of the room until you said hi to somebody, or at least thank Jack.